Today we're taking a look at all of the AM5 Mini-ITX motherboards that I could get my hands on from the likes of Asus, Asrock, Gigabyte and MSI. In total there are just 4 brands, of course, 4 main brands. We're not including any of the ones that you might get off AliExpress, though we could look at them in the near future. But anyway, 4 brands, just 8 motherboards across the entire AM5 platform. That is, of course, Mini-ITX motherboards, so there's really not that many of them. And that did make my job a bit easier than normal, but really I would have enjoyed checking out a few more. Anyway, we should probably get into it. It's quite surprising to me that after all this time and the success that the AM5 platform has already had, that MSI only offers a single Mini-ITX product, the MPG B650I Edge Wi-Fi. That said, MSI only ever offered a handful of AM4 Mini-ITX boards, so perhaps I shouldn't be that surprised. Anyway, the B650i Edge Wi-Fi, it's not exactly a cheap motherboard, coming in at $290 US, making it one of the more expensive AM5 Mini-ITX options out there. And I've got to say, for that price, it's a bit underwhelming. The V-Core portion of the VRM features 8 80-amp power stages, which is certainly sufficient, but it's also a bit lacking when compared to competing products. There's also no PCIe 5.0 support to speak of, and while PCIe 5.0 isn't a particularly useful feature right now, it might be in years to come. And AM5 is now supported to 2027 and beyond, according to AMD, so there's a good chance any AM5 board that you purchase now will still be in service beyond that point. The board does include 2 PCIe 4.0 M.2 ports, and having a second one is really nice for a Mini-ITX board. But again, at this price point, it's not a unique feature. It does, however, include 4 SATA ports, whereas most only include 2. That said, I doubt you'll be able to use all of them in most Mini-ITX cases. As for USB support, there's no USB 4, though there are 9 USB 3.2 ports and just 2 USB 2.0 ports. The pre-installed I/O shield isn't that well stocked either, just 6 USB ports in total there, and that includes a single Type-C. Then, like all AM5 Mini-ITX motherboards, you do get 2.5 Gigabit LAN and Wi-Fi 6E, so again the board is very standard in that respect. There's also 3 4-pin fan headers, and as it turns out, this is a standard, or really the configuration for all AM5 Mini-ITX motherboards. Now, the Asus ROG Strix X670E iGaming Wi-Fi is, in typical Asus fashion, by far the most expensive product here, with an asking price of $410 US, making it 40% more costly than the MSI model that we just looked at. Whether or not it does enough to justify the asking price, I guess that'll depend on what you're after in terms of features, but it is at the very least a high quality product. It's also the only X670E Mini-ITX motherboard, at least that I'm aware of, and there appear to be no other X670E or X670 Mini-ITX motherboards, which is surprising, though for this specific application, B650E probably makes more sense. What you're getting here is a massive 110 amp power stage V-Core VRM, so boatloads of power delivery there, and for good measure, the VRM heatsink also includes 2 small active fans, though they were inaudible in our testing, so that's good. Given that this is an X670E motherboard, you do get PCIe x16 5.0 slot, and the primary M.2 is also PCIe 5.0 compatible. And then there's an additional PCIe 4.0 M.2. There are just 2 SATA ports, which again makes sense for this form factor. Now, crucially, the board does offer 2 USB 4 ports, which really helps to justify the asking price. And in addition to that, you're also getting 10 USB 3.2 ports and 7 USB 2.0 ports. Then, of course, there is the standard Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 Gigabit LAN. There's really a lot to like about this board, such as the 10 USB ports that can be found on the I/O panel, 2 of which are USB 4. There's also no onboard audio, rather it's been moved off-board as an external USB device. And they've called this the ROG Strix Hive. It's an external audio solution that uses the Realtek ALC 4050 codec and the ESS Technology Sabre 9260Q DAC. The Hive includes a volume knob which can be pressed to mute the audio. There's also a pair of 3.5mm audio jacks for line out and line in, but there's also a number of other features that are unrelated to audio. Firstly, the Hive includes a USB Type-C and Type-A pass-through, and the Type-A port also supports BIOS flashback. There's also a series of LEDs which can be used to debug issues with the system. There's even a PBO button which allows the user to quickly enable or disable AMD's Precision Boost Overdrive feature. So the ROG Strix X670E gaming Wi-Fi is an impressive board, and really as a flagship AM5 Mini-ITX offering, it has no real competition. But if spending over $400 on a motherboard isn't your cup of tea, maybe the $120 US Gigabyte A620I AX might interest you. As the name suggests, this one uses the A620 chipset, so there's no CPU overclocking, but you still get memory overclocking, and for the most part, this is really all that matters. The VRM is pretty basic. The V-Core is supported by 5 55-amp power stages, though that should be more than enough power for the likes of the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, for example. Then, as you'd expect, there's no PCIe 5.0 support, which is fine, though disappointingly there is just a single M.2 slot with 2 SATA ports. The USB support is limited to just half a dozen USB 3.2 ports with 5 USB 2.0 ports, but you do get Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN. So it's a very basic motherboard, but there are comparable Micro ATX A620 boards priced around $110 US, so it's certainly not overpriced at $120 US. Still, it is very basic. There's just 4 USB 3.2 ports on the I/O panel, with an additional 2 USB 2.0 ports, and there is no pre-installed I/O shield. Now, for what we think is going to be about $40 US more, there is the B650 version called the B650I AX. Again, I'm not 100% sure on pricing, as it's not available in the US market yet, but we're going to assume that it's at least $20 more than the A620I AX. Now, for that additional investment, you do get the B650 chipset, and that's it. So CPU overclocking is now on the table, but with the same 5 55-amp power stages for the V-Core, don't expect too much headroom there. Essentially, the Gigabyte A620I AX and a B650I AX are the exact same motherboard, with the only differentiating factor being the chipset used, and that makes the B650I AX a very underwhelming product in my opinion. The Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra, on the other hand, is far more interesting, and although it costs $240 US, it does a lot to justify that asking price. Firstly, the VRM is up to the task with 8 105-amp power stages for the V-Core on a 12-layer PCB. Given this is a B650 board, you do get PCIe 4.0x16, though the primary M.2 slot is PCIe 5.0 compatible with an additional 2 PCIe 4.0 M.2s, giving the board a total of 3 M.2 slots, which is really nice. There is no USB 4 support though, but you are getting 8 USB 3.2 ports and 6 USB 2.0 ports, and the standard Wi-Fi 6E and 2.5 gigabit LAN is also present. The I/O panel is surprisingly basic with just 4 USB 3.2 Type A ports and an additional Type C, and then there are 2 USB 2.0 ports. So there's a reasonable degree of USB on offer there, but for the price, a few more 3.2 ports, they wouldn't have gone astray. Overall though, this is a solid board and certainly one of the better looking AM5 Mini-ITX options. Now for a look at some Asrock boards, and we'll start with the A620i Lightning Wi-Fi, which currently costs $140 US, so $20 more than Gigabyte's Mini-ITX A620 board. When compared to Gigabyte's offering, the A620i Lightning Wi-Fi looks to be a much better product. Firstly, you're getting 8 60-amp power stages for the V-Core, so much better than the 5 55-amp power stages offered by Gigabyte. There's also 2 M.2 slots, one PCIe 4.0 with the other 3.0, but it's really great to have that second expansion option there, especially for the Mini-ITX form factor. And for good measure, you're also getting an additional USB 3.2 port. The I/O shield's also pre-installed, so that's a really nice touch. Not something Gigabyte offers on the A620i AX, though the layout of the I/O and what's on offer in terms of connectivity is very similar. So that is to say that the A620i Lightning Wi-Fi, it's quite basic. As far as the board layout and design goes though, I think Asrock's done a bit better of a job. The VRM heatsink is much larger and I prefer the M.2 heat spreader. The fan headers are also better positioned, but really it's that much higher quality VRM that would see me go with the Asrock board. As was the case with Gigabyte's A620I AX and B650I AX, Gigabyte's B650i Lightning Wi-Fi is a B650 version of the A620i Lightning Wi-Fi. So you're getting the exact same motherboard with the B650 chipset. So that means the same 8 60-amp power stages for the V-core, the same I/O configuration, and the same motherboard layout. The only physical change has been made to the M.2 heat spreader, which is a bit larger now in the B650 version, but other than that, it's the same motherboard with CPU overclocking. Asrock also has the B650E PG-ITX Wi-Fi at $290, so this board is priced to compete with the MSI PG B650i Edge Wi-Fi, and frankly, it's a better board. Whereas MSI are offering 8 80-amp power stages for the V-core, Asrock has raised that to 10 105-amp power stages, so a similar configuration to the $410 Asus ROG Strix model. Now, because this is a B650E board, you are getting PCIe 5.0x16 along with a PCIe 5.0 enabled M.2 with an additional PCIe 4.0 M.2, and Asrock has also included a very large M.2 heatsink with active cooling, which is also connected to the main VRM heatsink using a heat pipe. I'd say the only disappointing aspect of this board is the I/O connectivity. For some reason, there's just 3 USB 3.2 Type A ports with an additional Type C, so 4 ports in total there, with another 4 USB 2.0 ports. So overall, there are a good number of USB ports, but half of them are the older 2.0 spec. So USB support is a bit lacking on this one, but otherwise it is a nice looking motherboard. Okay, so time for the testing, and we'll talk test system setup first. We are using the Thermaltake Tower 100 Mini-ITX case, and for cooling, the rather large Noctua NHD15 Chrome Max Black, but we are using a Ryzen 9 processor, so it's a little bit difficult to cool with a 120mm AIO or some sort of small heatsink. So we've gone with a big boy here to make sure that we are getting the most performance out of the CPU. Then for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'm reporting the peak PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a consistent ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. As for the stress test, I'm using the Ryzen 9 7950X, and for load Cinebench 2024, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. Okay, let's get into the results. As expected, the Asus ROG Strix has provided the best result with a peak temperature of just 69 degrees, thanks to some big heat sinks and of course those 110 amp power stages. Still, the Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra was also very impressive, peaking at 76 degrees, and it was able to get the most out of the Ryzen 9 processor. The MSI B650i Edge Wi-Fi, it also did well at 77 degrees. Then we find our first A620 board, the Asrock A620i Lightning Wi-Fi, at just 80 degrees, which appears to be a great result, but not so fast. This board limited itself to a sustained power delivery of just 165 watts, which is 13% less than that of the MSI board. And the MSI board was quite efficient with its voltages, so realistically power draw should be over 200 watts. But by capping the power output, the A620 board reduced the Cinebench score by 6%, which admittedly isn't a lot, but it also means this board isn't optimal for the 7950X. Still, it did only run at 80 degrees, and this power limit means it will be able to run all other Ryzen processors with ease, so it's a decent board in that regard. Then we have the Asrock B650E PG-ITX Wi-Fi delivering 222 watts for a peak operating temperature of 86 degrees. So 10 degrees more than the Aorus Ultra, but still a very acceptable result, and, well, a good result really. The Asrock B650i Lightning Wi-Fi also peaked at 86 degrees, but it did so with a sustained power output of 164 watts, which isn't enough to extract the full performance from the 7950X, but it will be enough for all other AM5 Ryzen processors. Then we have the Gigabyte A620I AX and B650I AX, both peaked at well over 100 degrees and were heavily power limited to just 137 watts. The Ryzen 9 7950X still performed surprisingly well despite those power limits, and in fact it wasn't that much slower than boards that allowed for over 200 watts, which really does speak to the efficiency of these Zen 4 processors. Still, given the 137 watt sustained power limit of these Gigabyte boards, I'd avoid them if you can, and we'll go take a look at what you should be buying now. Here are the 8 AM5 Mini-ITX motherboards that are sold by Asus, Asrock, Gigabyte, and MSI. As we just saw, the Gigabyte A620I AX and B650I AX didn't test very well, and while they will work fine with Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 processors, especially if you're gaming, there are better options. The Asrock A620i Lightning, for example, ran much cooler under the same load, as it packs a much better power delivery while also offering an additional M.2 slot, which you'll find very useful in this form factor, given that you can't simply add more M.2s via a PCIe slot. Well, you could, but then you wouldn't have a graphics card, I suppose. So for $20 more than the Gigabyte A620i AX, I recommend getting the Asrock A620i Lightning. Stepping up to $200, the Asrock B650i Lightning Wi-Fi is a decent board, though truth be told, apart from CPU overclocking, it doesn't really offer much over Asrock's A620 version, so you're paying a massive 43% premium for CPU overclocking and a PCIe 5.0 M.2 slot. You're not even getting an extra M.2, it's just an upgrade to one of the existing ports. So if you don't require CPU overclocking and saving money is the priority, then I'd just go for the A620 version. Moreover, if you're willing to push the budget to at least $200 US, I reckon go a little bit further and secure the Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra, as it's a great high-end option. There's no power delivery concerns here. You're getting 3 M.2 slots, 4 SATA ports, and plenty of USB options. It's a great board. Then pushing the budget to almost $300, I feel the Asrock B650E PG-ITX Wi-Fi is a bit disappointing when compared to the much cheaper B650i Aorus Ultra. Sure, you do get PCIe 5.0 for the primary PCIe x16 slot, but there's just 2 M.2 slots, and USB support is about the same, with one less USB 3.2 port, so it's absolutely not worth the 21% premium. The MSI MPG B650i Edge Wi-Fi is in a similar position. In fact, it's even worse. The VRM is no better than the Aorus Ultra. You're still only getting PCIe 4.0 x16. There's just 2 PCIe 4.0 M.2s. And while it does have 9 USB 3.2 ports, which is nice, there's just 2 USB 2.0 ports. It's obviously not a bad board, but at $290 US, it's very poorly priced. This would be a decent offering at, say, $200 US. Then finally, we have the mighty Asus ROG Strix X670E iGaming Wi-Fi, which has no competition as it's the only X670 series Mini-ITX motherboard, and it's the only board to be priced over $400 US. Whether or not it's worth that will depend entirely on what you're after. There's no question that it's the best quality board here. It absolutely is. But boy, is it the most expensive, at around 70% more expensive than the Aorus Ultra. When compared to the flagship Gigabyte board, you're only getting a slightly higher quality VRM that runs a little bit cooler, but at that point, it really is a non-issue. There's PCIe 5.0 for the primary x16 slot, but you're getting one less M.2, which is surprising, and there's also 2 less SATA ports. But you are getting a pair of USB 4 ports, and this is the only AM5 Mini-ITX motherboard to offer USB 4. You're also getting a massive 10 USB 3.2 ports with 7 USB 2.0 ports, so the USB support is unrivaled. Asus's ROG Strix Hive is also an awesome feature, but again, how useful it is will depend on your use case. So the 3 standard options for me include the Asrock A620i Lightning Wi-Fi, the Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra, and the Asus ROG Strix X670E iGaming Wi-Fi. And I think the Aorus Ultra offers the best balance of features and price, and it's what I'd go with if I was building a Mini-ITX AM5 system. As a side note, I have purchased a very cheap AM5 Mini-ITX motherboard from AliExpress, which cost me what amounts to about $93 US. And I'll have a dedicated video on that board shortly, so make sure you hang around for that one. Hopefully it'll be out early next week. For this one though, I am done. So I hope for those of you who have been craving some Mini-ITX AM5 action that this has satisfied your cravings. And if it has, hit the like button, comment, subscribe, do all that YouTube related stuff. And if you'd like more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we do have Floatplane Patreon. Check out either one of those. We'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, so you can join the Hardware Unboxed community. Great place to hang out and talk tech, amongst other things. What else do we have? We have behind-the-scenes content, Q&A stuff, and a monthly live stream. So yeah, check that out if you're interested, but if not, it's perfectly fine. and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.